Sir, people like you usually come through the back service entrance, not the front. That was the first thing she said to him, with the kind of cold certainty that only comes from someone who's made up their mind before you've even opened your mouth. It wasn't whispered. It wasn't vague. It was clear, sharp, and meant to wound without leaving a visible mark. Before we dive into what happens next, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing how far these stories go. And if this story already hit a nerve, tap like and hit subscribe, now. Let me take you to Charleston, South Carolina, early evening. Just as the warm southern sky had begun to shift into that soft tangerine haze that only seems to appear when the day's heat starts to settle and the streetlights flicker awake one by one. And standing at the curb in front of the historic Regal Crest Hotel was a man named Langston Reed, who carried himself not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who had earned everything the hard way, step by deliberate step, over decades of work that no one applauded but everyone now benefited from. He wore tailored charcoal gray slacks, a white button-down shirt with the collar slightly open, and a navy topcoat that moved with him like it had known his pace for years. In his right hand, a weathered leather duffel bag, not flashy, just honest, like the man himself. The Regal Crest, a five-star colonial-style hotel in one of Charleston's oldest districts, stood like a southern aristocrat, elegant, imposing, wrapped in tradition and draped in expectations, with its white columns reaching skyward and the grand iron doors polished to a mirror shine. Langston took a quiet breath before stepping through the revolving door, already knowing this wouldn't be just another site visit, already suspecting what he'd find after reading that anonymous email 2 weeks earlier. A message that simply read, "They don't treat us right here. Not everyone follows the values you built this brand on. Come and see for yourself." So he had come, without announcement, without entourage, using his own name on a discreet reservation, not because he needed to be recognized, but because he wanted the truth to meet him head-on, inside. The lobby was everything the website promised, marble floors gleaming like glass, crystal chandeliers humming softly above, and the scent of fresh lilies mixed with the faint trace of aged bourbon from the nearby lounge. At the center of the room stood the front desk, behind which was Deborah Sinclair, the general manager, a white woman in her early 50s with perfectly styled silver hair, a tailored navy blazer, and a smile that seemed to flicker only when she recognized someone as deserving of her attention. She didn't greet Langston when he approached. Instead, she gave him a quick up-and-down glance, the kind that lasts less than a second but says everything she thinks she needs to know. "Good evening," Langston said calmly, his voice low and steady. "I'm checking in. Reservation should be under Reed." "Langston Reed?" Deborah tilted her head slightly, eyebrows lifting as if the name itself surprised her, then tapped a few keys on her computer without saying a word. After a brief moment, she looked back up and said, "There's nothing under that name." Langston, still calm, pulled out his phone and opened the email confirmation, flipping the screen to show her. The subject line read, "Reservation. Confirmed. Regal Crest, Charleston, Executive Suite." But Deborah didn't even lean forward to read it. "We've had a few issues lately with people trying to use fake confirmations," she said, her voice polite in tone but sharp in purpose. "Sometimes folks just walk in and expect we won't notice." Langston blinked, not out of shock, but out of familiarity. "I understand," he said simply, "but this one's not fake." He kept his voice composed, even when she followed with that infamous line, "Sir, people like you usually come through the back service entrance, not the front. Around them." The lobby seemed to quiet just enough for her words to carry. A couple by the fireplace looked over. A man at the concierge desk froze mid-sentence, and even the soft piano music playing over the speakers felt like it had paused. Langston didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stared at her for a moment, as if giving her one last chance to walk herself back. When she didn't, he nodded once, stepped away from the desk, and walked toward a quiet corner near a potted fiddle-leaf fig tree. Pulling out his phone again, he dialed a number from memory. "Yeah," he said softly into the receiver. "It happened. Just like the message said. I'm here now." A short pause. "You close?" Another pause. "All right then. I'll wait." He tucked the phone back into his coat and stood there, not pacing, not checking his watch, just waiting. And that's where the story truly begins. Not with the insult, not even with the silence that followed it, but with the moment a man who owned the very walls around him was told he didn't belong inside them. Behind the front desk, in the small operations office tucked just out of view from the chandelier-lit lobby, a quiet tension was already beginning to stir, the kind that doesn't come from raised voices, but from looks passed between co-workers, and the sudden way people begin to second-guess what they just witnessed but didn't stop. Luis Ortega, the evening desk associate, had been working at the Regal Crest for nearly 4 years, not long enough to be jaded, but long enough to know when something didn't sit right. He'd watched from the side as Deborah brushed off the well-dressed black man who had entered just minutes ago, saw the way her eyes skimmed over his clothes, the way she barely glanced at the email confirmation he politely offered. And when she told him, with that clipped tone of hers, to use the back entrance, Luis felt a twist in his gut he couldn't ignore. As soon as Langston stepped away and Deborah returned to her screen like nothing had happened, Luis ducked into the back room and quietly pulled up the reservations log. He typed in the name, Langston Reed. There it was, right at the top, confirmed, executive suite, VIP status, flagged for special attention, the kind of guest whose arrival would normally trigger fresh flowers, a handwritten welcome card, and complimentary champagne delivered within 10 minutes of check-in. He stared at the screen for a moment, blinking once, then twice. Deborah had lied, not just mistaken, not just unaware. She had seen his name, known who he was, and decided to ignore it. Just then, May Jenkins, the housekeeping supervisor, walked in, clipboard in hand. May had been with the hotel since it opened under new ownership 10 years ago. She was a quiet woman, mid-60s, tall, proud, and graceful in a way that came from years of navigating rooms full of people who didn't always see her. She noticed the way Luis hovered near the screen, his jaw tight, his brows furrowed, and she tilted her head slightly. "Something wrong, baby?" she asked in that warm drawl that softened even the sharpest edges. Luis hesitated, then nodded toward the monitor. "Guest out front, Langston Reed. Deborah just turned him away." He whispered, "But look at this." May leaned in, scanned the screen, and her lips tightened. She muttered, the sound carrying the weight of recognition, not of the name, but of the pattern. She'd seen it before, in other places, in other forms. And now, it had found its way back into this lobby, under a new manager's watch. Meanwhile, in the hallway just outside the staff lounge, Hannah Keller, the hotel's newest intern, 23, fresh out of hospitality school, bright-eyed and still believing people meant well, overheard May's soft mutter and paused. Hannah had been at the front desk earlier, sorting luggage tags when the man in the navy coat arrived. She hadn't heard exactly what was said, but she saw enough, the cool dismissal, the uncomfortable stillness, and the way the man stood tall despite it all. Something about it unsettled her, not because it was loud or dramatic, but because it was quiet, too quiet, back in the operations room. May glanced around, then gently closed the door behind her. She lowered her voice. You know who that man is? Luis shook his head. Not exactly, but something tells me he ain't just another guest. May folded her arms. I seen a few folks like him come through here. Smart, patient, the kind who watches first, then moves, and Deborah just embarrassed herself in front of the wrong one. Luis exhaled slowly. What do we do? May held his gaze. We do what's right. Son, whether or not anyone's watching. But deep down, Luis knew the hotel didn't always reward what was right. It rewarded what kept the surface polished. Still, he pulled out his phone and took a quick photo of the reservation screen, just in case someone decided to update the file later. Out in the hallway, Hannah tapped gently on the open door. Sorry to interrupt, she said quietly, but I think something's happening out front. The man's still there. He's not yelling, but he's just standing, waiting. May nodded, already moving. Let's keep eyes open, she said. He may not be who they think he is. And in that moment, behind those staff-only doors, 3 people who didn't share a last name, a background, or a history, all understood the same unspoken truth. That silence is not neutral, and choosing to see can sometimes be the most dangerous thing in the room. They returned to their duties, pretending nothing had shifted, but inside each of them, something had, because what none of them knew, at least not yet, was that the man in the lobby had been watching them too, not just how they treated him, but how they treated each other. He wasn't just there to inspect a property, he was there to examine character, and if anyone had bothered to ask, to look past the skin, past the coat and the duffel bag, past the assumptions dressed as protocol, they might have known what he had built. Langston Reed had once been a kid with no last name of his own, raised in a group home just outside Harlem, who worked nights mopping floors at a transit depot while teaching himself business accounting from a borrowed textbook. By the time he was 31, he had acquired his first building, a rundown motel he flipped into a boutique inn with just 6 rooms and a mission to hire locals who were often overlooked. That single property grew into dozens. And now, Langston owned one of the fastest-growing black-owned hospitality firms in the country, a company built on one quiet promise, that no one would ever be made to feel invisible under his roof. But tonight, in the very house he built, he had just been told he didn't belong, and for the first time in a long time, he was not going to walk away quietly. Langston was still standing near the potted fiddle-leaf fig, calm and composed, his phone now tucked away, when the sound of heels clicked across the marble behind him, sharp, decisive steps that always announced themselves before the person wearing them ever spoke. Deborah Sinclair had returned to the desk, accompanied this time by a second employee, a younger concierge named Robert who looked equal parts confused and uncomfortable. "Sir," she called out again, louder now, her voice carrying across the lobby like a teacher scolding a student who dared question a rule. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave. This is a private establishment. We reserve the right to refuse service, especially when a guest cannot provide valid credentials." Her words, wrapped in formality, echoed in the high-ceilinged lobby. And Langston turned slowly, his face unreadable, his hands still relaxed at his sides. He didn't respond immediately, and the silence that followed felt heavier than any outburst could have. A couple sitting near the fireplace shifted uncomfortably. The doorman glanced toward the desk but didn't move. Over by the elevators, a group of out-of-town business travelers paused their conversation. That's when the moment shifted, when the air turned electric, and the assumptions that had been quietly swirling started to harden into something harder, more dangerous. From a tufted velvet armchair near the grand piano, an older woman stood up. She wore a cream-colored jacket, pearl earrings, and the kind of air that suggested she was used to being listened to. Eleanor Whitford, a regular guest and legacy client of the hotel, stepped forward with her chin lifted and her voice strong. "I've been staying here for over 30 years, she declared, not looking at Langston, but speaking about him, to Deborah, to the room, to anyone who might be unsure where they should stand. This establishment was built on tradition, on class. We don't allow just anybody to waltz in and claim space. That's how standards fall." The room fell deathly quiet. Even the pianist, who had just begun a quiet instrumental version of Blue Moon, stopped mid-phrase. Langston turned his gaze toward Eleanor. Not aggressive, not even angry, but something deeper, a look that measured a person not by what they said, but by what they chose to reveal about themselves. At the far end of the room, a young man in his 20s, sharp suit, neat curls, standing near the windows, clenched his jaw and stepped half a pace forward before stopping himself. That was Micah Whitford, Eleanor's grandson. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His expression said enough. He looked at his grandmother like he was seeing her through a different lens. Not for the first time, but maybe for the first time without apology. Meanwhile, over by the bar, Nora Fields, a frequent business traveler from Atlanta who had arrived just 20 minutes earlier, reached into her purse, pulled out her phone, and pressed record. She didn't zoom in. She didn't speak. She simply held the phone low, letting it capture the scene as it unfolded, the tension, the faces, the dignity of one man against a wall of assumptions. Langston finally stepped forward, not rushing, not reacting, just reclaiming the space that had been taken from him. "You've seen my ID," he said, his voice clear but never raised. "You've seen the reservation, yet here I stand, being accused of not belonging, not because of a policy, but because of a perception." Deborah opened her mouth, but Langston raised his hand gently. "I don't need an apology," he said. "Not yet. What I need is for everyone in this room to ask themselves one thing. If I had looked different, if I had walked in here wearing a different skin, would this conversation have happened at all?" No one answered. Not even Deborah. In fact, she turned her face away, eyes darting toward the office doors as if hoping for backup, for rescue, for an exit she hadn't earned. A guest coughed. Another adjusted his collar. Eleanor, unmoved, huffed and returned to her seat, muttering something about modern entitlement under her breath. While Micah simply stared at Langston with the quiet recognition of someone who had been taught one version of the world and was now watching it unravel in real time. Langston didn't linger. He stepped back again, returning to the exact spot he'd been in before, as if to say, "I'm not going anywhere." And in that stillness, a different kind of authority emerged, not the kind that yells or threatens or points fingers, but the kind that speaks with presence, with patience, and with the power of knowing exactly who you are. The silence in the lobby stretched out like a held breath. Then, outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Rain had begun to fall, steady and soft, against the tall glass windows, as if the sky itself had decided to lean in and listen. No one moved, not Deborah, not the other staff, not the guests pretending to read newspapers or scroll their phones. And here's where I want to pause, just for a moment, and ask you, have you ever witnessed something like this? Not just a moment of disrespect, but a moment where someone was tested, not for what they said, but for how calmly they carried themselves through humiliation. If you have, or if you've been that person, share your story below. Because these stories matter. They don't just reveal what's broken. They show us who's watching, who speaks, and who stays silent. And as the rain tapped softly on the windows of the Regal Crest, The quiet strength of Langston Reed had already started to ripple outward. Not because he demanded it, but because truth, when it stands still long enough, becomes impossible to ignore. The rain outside had begun to thicken into a slow, steady curtain, not harsh, not violent, but persistent, tapping against the tall glass windows of the Regal Crest lobby with a rhythm that somehow mirrored the tension inside, where guests still sat too straight, staff still moved too carefully, and Langston Reed remained motionless near the same potted fig. His silence speaking volumes no one dared interrupt. The atmosphere had shifted entirely, no longer just uncomfortable but unstable, like something unspoken had started to crack the air open, something nobody in the room quite knew how to stop. And then, as if on cue, the double-glass doors at the front of the hotel slowly parted with a soft hiss, letting in the sound of tires on wet pavement and the low hum of a luxury engine idling at the curb. Heads turned instinctively. The doorman stepped forward, confused. No valet was expected. No black SUV was scheduled for arrival. Yet here it was, sleek and silent, with dark-tinted windows and no markings, the kind of vehicle that didn't need to explain itself. And then the rear door opened, slow and deliberate, and out stepped a tall man dressed in a charcoal gray three-piece suit, dark tie, silver cufflinks gleaming beneath the lobby lights. Clarence Bell did not rush. He didn't carry luggage. He didn't scan the room. He simply looked in one direction, toward Langston, and gave a slight nod. The kind of gesture exchanged between men who had been through fire together and knew they didn't need words to start the next chapter. He stepped fully into the lobby, his polished shoes clicking against the tile like a metronome set to authority, and as he passed the front desk, Deborah instinctively straightened her blazer and smoothed her skirt, sensing something was wrong but not yet knowing just how wrong. Luis, watching from the hallway, froze mid-step. Hannah, near the concierge desk, looked up from her tablet and immediately noticed the way Langston's posture shifted, not in intimidation, but in quiet acknowledgement. May, standing half-hidden in a service doorway, whispered under her breath. Well now, as if watching a storm roll in from the ocean, Clarence walked right up to Langston, paused, and extended a hand, but instead of a shake, he placed his hand gently on Langston's shoulder, a touch of friendship, but also solidarity, and the two men exchanged the kind of glance that didn't need to be explained to anyone paying attention. It's worse than we thought, Langston said quietly, his voice calm but edged with gravity. Clarence gave one slow nod. Then let's handle it, he replied, then turned toward the front desk without waiting for permission. Deborah blinked. Can I help you, sir? She asked, already unsure of the words as they left her mouth. Clarence didn't raise his voice, didn't flash credentials, didn't even say his name. He simply looked at her with eyes sharpened by years of boardrooms, negotiations, and rooms that didn't expect to be interrupted. I need you to gather your full management team, he said simply. Now. Deborah hesitated. I'm not sure I understand. You will, Clarence replied, his tone still calm. And I'd advise you not to delay. The weight of the room shifted again, first in the staff, then in the guests, who could feel the air thickening into something real. Robert, the young concierge, took a half-step back. Luis glanced at May, who gave a near imperceptible nod, as if to say, this is it. Hannah swallowed hard, unsure whether she was witnessing a scandal or a reckoning, but feeling deep in her gut that this wasn't something she'd forget. Over near the fireplace, Eleanor peered over the top of her newspaper and narrowed her eyes, unable to place Clarence but instantly recognizing the kind of power that didn't wear a name tag. Micah watched silently from across the room, the tension in his jaw now mixed with something else. Curiosity, maybe even hope. Nora, still holding her phone low, kept recording, and through it all, Langston never moved. He didn't need to. His presence, his restraint, his silence, it all spoke louder than anything he could have said. Clarence turned back toward his friend. "You sure you want to do this here?" he asked, not mocking, just checking. Langston nodded once. "Yes," he said. "Here is exactly where it needs to happen." And in that moment, with the rain tapping against the glass, with guests holding their breath, with every employee now sensing the ground shifting beneath their feet, the story began to turn. No one had shouted. No threats had been made. But the dynamic had flipped, clean and quiet, like a chessboard turned over in the middle of the game. Deborah, for the first time in years, felt unsure of her footing and what she didn't yet realize, what no one outside the boardroom walls of Regal Crest's corporate offices knew, was that Clarence Bell was not just a man in a suit, and Langston Reed was not just a guest with a grievance. Together, they represented something far more dangerous to systems built on appearance and assumption: the truth, armed with patience, money, and the absolute certainty of their own worth. The lobby remained still, guests unsure whether to stay or leave, staff frozen between policy and instinct. Langston took a quiet step forward, his voice as even as ever. "Let's bring them in," he said. "It's time we have a conversation, not behind closed doors, but right here, where it started." And without another word, Deborah picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly, dialing the internal line that would summon the rest of the leadership team. Unaware that the moment they entered that room, nothing about this hotel would ever be the same. The air in the conference lounge had thickened, not from heat, but from the quiet realization that something irreversible was about to happen. And no one, not Deborah, not the other department heads now seated around the polished oak table, could quite name it yet, though they all felt it in the weight of Langston Reed's silence as he stood at the head of the room, not demanding attention, but commanding it by his very presence. The door clicked shut behind them, the softest sound in the room, but it might as well have been a gavel. Clarence Bell stood to one side, his arms loosely folded, his eyes fixed on the staff like a man watching a lesson unfold, not because he enjoyed it, but because it was necessary. Deborah cleared her throat and tried to regain footing, gesturing stiffly to the remaining department heads, food and beverage, operations, housekeeping, most of whom looked between one another, confused, their eyes darting from Clarence to Langston as if waiting for someone to explain what they were doing here, and why no one had spoken yet. But then Langston took one small step forward, calm, steady, the room stilling even more as he rested his hands gently on the back of a leather chair and spoke. Not with fury, not with bitterness, but with a deep, clear steadiness that could only come from a man who'd had to hold his dignity in the face of disrespect too many times to count. "Before we begin," he said, his voice resonant but never raised, "I want to thank you all for coming. I know this wasn't expected. And I know most of you don't know who I am, or why I'm standing here." He looked around the room, pausing, letting the silence hang just long enough for attention to settle, then continued. "My name is Langston Reed, and I am the owner of this hotel." There was no explosion, no gasp, just a collective stillness, as if the room had stopped breathing. It took several seconds before anyone moved. Deborah's face shifted first, a hard blink, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, as the reality of the moment settled in. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Across the table, Luis Ortega stiffened, his jaw tightening not in anger, but in guilt. He had seen the reservation. He had known something was wrong. And now he realized just how wrong it truly was. In the far corner of the room, Hannah Keller, barely 23, placed a hand slowly over her chest, eyes wide. Her breath caught halfway between disbelief and embarrassment. Mae Jenkins, however, didn't flinch. She stood near the window, her clipboard pressed lightly to her hip, and simply gave a small nod. Not of surprise, but of respect, as if something she'd long suspected had just been confirmed. Langston continued, unfazed. I founded the Reed Group 10 years ago, after turning a single foreclosed property into a community-focused hospitality space. Today, we manage 24 boutique hotels across the country, including this one. And I came here today unannounced because I received a message from a former guest about how some people were treated when they walked through these doors. His voice never cracked, never faltered, but the weight behind it pressed into the room like gravity. And I needed to see it with my own eyes. From the hallway, just outside the open conference room door, Nora Fields stood quietly, her phone no longer recording, her arm by her side, her expression solemn. She didn't need to film anymore. The truth was already doing its work. Across the lobby, Eleanor Whitford, still seated in the velvet armchair she'd all but claimed as her own over the years, was now staring down at the hotel brochure in her lap, her fingers no longer adjusting her pearls, her gaze fixed but unfocused. Her grandson, Micah, who had stepped inside the room moments before, leaned against the doorway now, arms crossed, not smug, not satisfied, just watching, quietly proud of the man who had somehow absorbed humiliation and returned it with grace. Langston didn't call names. He didn't belittle. He simply told the truth. A truth that stung not because it was cruel, but because it was clear. Every guest, he said, scanning the faces of the people he paid to carry out his vision, deserves to be treated with dignity, not because of what they wear, not because of what they look like, not because of what they're worth, but because they're human. Deborah finally found her voice, weak and breaking. Mr. Reed, I didn't know. But Langston raised a hand gently, stopping her without needing to press. That's the problem, he said. You didn't care to. The room fell still again, not out of fear, but out of reflection. Because in that moment, every person sitting at that table knew this wasn't just about one mistake. It was about a culture, a habit, a reflex they'd allowed to grow unchecked under a facade of professionalism. Clarence finally stepped forward, his tone as quiet as Langston's but edged with finality. There will be changes, he said. Starting today, we don't fire people without review, but we don't tolerate this kind of negligence either. And this wasn't just a lapse in service. This was a failure in character. Deborah's face paled. One of the other managers swallowed hard. Hannah looked down at her notebook, her hands trembling just slightly. Mae, still quiet, let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. Luis closed his eyes, just for a second, and nodded. Langston turned one last time to the group. This isn't about punishment, he said. It's about accountability. And it's about making sure no one ever walks through these doors again and gets asked to use the service entrance simply because of who they are. Then, with a quiet calm, he stepped back, nodded to Clarence, and walked out of the room. Not because he was done, but because the real work was just about to begin. The sun had disappeared completely now, leaving behind only the soft glow of golden lobby sconces and the silver reflection of streetlights bouncing off wet pavement outside. And inside, within those historic walls of the Regal Crest Hotel, a different kind of light was beginning to emerge, not from chandeliers or polished floors, but from clarity, from consequence, from the unmistakable gravity of truth spoken out loud and no longer able to be ignored. Langston Reed didn't return to the conference room after his quiet exit. Instead, he stood in the main lobby, the very space where he had been judged just hours earlier, facing the staff and guests with the same calm presence he carried when he first stepped through the door. He wasn't there to shout. He wasn't there to punish out of anger. He was there to correct, to reset, to make visible what had for too long gone unseen. One by one, the department heads were called back into the lobby. Clarence Bell remained beside Langston, clipboard in hand, speaking only when necessary, a witness, a partner, but never the mouthpiece. Langston looked first to Deborah Sinclair, whose face had lost its color but not its pride, her arms stiff at her sides, her jaw slightly clenched, as though still searching for a way to justify what had just been so plainly revealed. "You've managed this hotel for 4 years," Langston began, "and I'm sure there are things you've done well, but tonight, you showed me something I can't unsee, that your instincts are shaped by bias, and that your authority has been used to divide, not to lead." Deborah tried to speak, a trembling syllable barely escaping her lips, but Langston gently raised a hand. "You had a choice," he said. "When I arrived, a choice to pause and ask questions, a choice to check the system, a choice to treat me with basic human courtesy. You made another choice, and because of that, your employment with Regal Crest ends tonight." There was no gasp, no applause, just silence, and the distant sound of rain continuing to fall outside. Deborah didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply stood there for a moment, blinking slowly, as if trying to wake from a dream that had turned hard and undeniable. Then, without another word, she turned and walked toward the staff exit, heels echoing down the side corridor until the sound faded completely. Langston turned next to Luis Ortega, who had been standing off to the side, head slightly bowed, hands folded in front of him. "Luis," he said, and the young man looked up quickly, shame and worry heavy in his expression. "You saw what happened. You knew it wasn't right. And though you didn't speak up in the moment, you checked, you documented, and more importantly, you didn't cover for anyone." Luis opened his mouth, his voice cracking a little. "I should have said something sooner. Sir, I just—" But Langston held up a hand again, this time not in dismissal, but in grace. "What matters now is that you understand why silence is never neutral, that you grow from it, and I believe you will. Starting today, you'll be promoted to assistant front desk manager. I want people like you in charge of first impressions." Luis's eyes brimmed with tears, and he nodded slowly, almost in disbelief, a quiet thank you escaping his lips. Then Langston looked to May Jenkins, who hadn't moved from her spot near the pillar by the lobby's edge, tall, steady, proud. "Ms. Jenkins," he said, "you didn't just notice the moment, you understood it. You saw through the performance. You've been doing this job with integrity for a long time, and tonight, you reminded me of why this place was worth building in the first place." May smiled gently, her voice calm. "You built something rare, Mr. Reed. I just tried to keep it honest." Langston nodded once. "Starting tomorrow, you'll oversee regional training for new housekeeping supervisors across our southeast locations. We need your eye, your heart, and your memory." May lowered her head slightly, not in submission, but in respect. A silent bond shared between people who had walked similar roads and arrived with dignity still intact. Hannah Keller, the youngest in the room, stood nervously near the desk, clutching her notebook to her chest like a shield. She'd said nothing all night, but her eyes had watched everything, her face full of questions she hadn't yet dared to voice. Langston approached her slowly, but kindly. "You've got a lot to learn," he said, not unkindly. "But I saw how you looked when it happened. You knew something was wrong. You didn't understand it yet, but you felt it. That's where growth begins." Hannah nodded quickly, eyes wide. "I wanted to help. I didn't know if it was my place." Langston smiled gently. "Let me be clear. Decency is always your place. Starting next quarter, you'll be enrolled in our corporate mentorship program. I'll pair you with someone who can teach you how to lead from the inside out." Her shoulders sagged a little, the kind of relief that only comes after carrying silent guilt for too long. And one by one, Langston met each gaze, some filled with remorse, some with renewed purpose, not to shame them, but to remind them that choices have weight, and that every moment in uniform carries a responsibility not just to serve, but to see. Across the lobby, guests watched quietly, some standing now, others peering over the tops of newspapers or screens, as if realizing for the first time that the story they had entered was not about a booking gone wrong, but a truth long overdue. Near the fireplace, Eleanor Whitford, who had earlier dismissed Langston with the kind of arrogance inherited over generations, stood slowly, her posture softer now. She didn't approach, didn't speak, but she placed her hotel keycard on the table beside her and walked out into the night without a word, her grandson Micah following behind, a quiet kind of pride in his step. And as the clock above the mantel chimed softly, Langston looked around the room one last time and said, not with finality, but with quiet hope, "What happened tonight won't be buried. It'll be built on, and from here forward, every guest who walks through these doors, no matter where they're from, what they look like, or how they speak, will be met with the same thing: dignity." It wasn't a speech. It was a promise. And this time, everyone was listening. 1 month later, beneath a late morning sky stretched wide over Charleston's historic district, the rooftop terrace of the Regal Crest Hotel had been transformed into something more than just a view. It had become a symbol. Rows of chairs lined the wooden deck, facing a small podium framed by tall ferns and white linens fluttering in the breeze. A modest crowd had gathered, staff in fresh uniforms, community leaders in pressed suits, members of the press with quiet cameras, and standing in the front row was Langston Reed, not dressed in a coat and tie this time, but in a crisp, open-collar shirt and dark slacks, sleeves rolled up just enough to remind everyone that while some men lead from the front, others lead from the foundation. To his right stood Clarence Bell, hands clasped loosely in front of him, watching the guests arrive with the calm presence of a man who had seen this moment built brick by brick, not overnight, but over years of grit, restraint, and hard-earned grace. The new general manager, promoted internally from another branch, stood at the side quietly observing, while Mae Jenkins, now bearing a regional title, moved through the staff like a quiet shepherd, adjusting a tie here, offering a nod there. Luis Ortega, now in a tailored vest with a nameplate that read, "Assistant Manager," stood taller than anyone had ever seen him stand, greeting press and guests with a soft confidence that hadn't existed a month before. And Hannah Keller, just weeks into her mentorship program, was holding a clipboard and coordinating check-ins with calm determination, no longer wide-eyed, but steady, thoughtful, and awake. As the final guests took their seats, Langston stepped toward the podium. No lights, no fanfare, just a microphone and a truth that needed to be spoken. The wind caught his words gently as he began. "Exactly 31 days ago," he said, "I stood in the lobby of this hotel, not as a billionaire, not as an owner, not even as a guest, but as a man who was told, politely and with great confidence, that he didn't belong." A quiet murmur moved through the audience, some nodding, some shifting in their seats. I was reminded that even in the buildings we build ourselves, he continued, we can still be made to feel like outsiders, not because of who we are, but because of who people assume we're not. He paused then, letting the weight of that truth settle. But we're not here today to relive that, he added, his voice softening. We're here because something good can come out of it, not in spite of the pain, but because we're willing to face it. He turned slightly toward the staff and then back to the guests. I'm proud to announce the launch of the Reed Standard, a company-wide initiative that will apply not only to this hotel, but to every property under the Reed Group name moving forward. A light breeze passed over the rooftop as he continued. It includes mandatory training in unconscious bias, accountability protocols for guest treatment, a new review system for internal hiring, and a staff-led council focused on culture, inclusion, and continuous learning. But more than that, it's a promise that no one who works for us will ever mistake appearance for character again, that no guest will ever be turned away because someone couldn't see past their own reflection. Applause followed, not loud, but sincere. Langston's expression didn't change. He wasn't performing. He was planting something. This isn't a marketing campaign, he went on. It's not a photo op. It's a compass. And if we follow it, we won't just change policies. We'll change people. From the back row, Nora Fields, the guest who had recorded the original moment, stood quietly beside her camera crew, arms crossed, eyes filled with something deeper than journalistic curiosity, conviction. She hadn't shared the clip right away. She'd waited, and when she finally did, after Langston asked her to, it had gone viral within 48 hours, drawing nearly 12 million views and sparking national coverage about bias in luxury spaces. But today, she wasn't here as a reporter. She was here as a witness. Across from her, Micah Whitford, seated beside an empty chair, listened intently, the memory of his grandmother's silence still fresh, but now tempered by a growing sense of his own voice, one he was finally learning to use. Langston closed his speech not with a call to arms, but with a simple truth that felt more like a blessing than a conclusion. I built these places not for applause, he said, but because I believed hospitality was about more than comfort. It was about belonging. It was about looking someone in the eye and saying, "You're welcome here, just as you are." And then he smiled. Not wide, not flashy, but deeply. The kind of smile that comes after years of restraint. The kind that holds both pain and peace. We're not asking for special treatment, he added. We're just asking people to look again and see the whole person. The audience rose to their feet, not out of obligation, but because something in them had risen first, something unspoken, something overdue. And as the rooftop slowly cleared and the staff returned to work, no longer simply workers, but part of something living and breathing. Langston stepped to the edge of the terrace and looked out over the city, his city, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to feel proud not just of what he'd built, but of what he'd stood for. Rain had turned the sidewalks below into mirrors, and from up high, they reflected the sky, open, wide, and waiting for whatever came next. Thanks for watching. If this story spoke to you, like, subscribe, and share your thoughts below. Until next time, stay kind, stay aware.